The weight of kindness. The sun was already high in the sky as David Parker, or Davy, as everyone called him, trudged down the cracked sidewalk, his patched-up backpack bouncing against his back. He adjusted the straps and glanced at his worn-out sneakers. The soles were peeling at the edges, and each step felt like walking on paper-thin cardboard. He couldn't afford to get new ones, not with all the bills piling up at home. Davy's mother worked tirelessly, but her income from cleaning houses barely covered the rent, let alone the electricity that had been cut off a week ago. He'd overheard her on the phone the night before, her voice trembling as she pleaded for an extension. Davy clenched his jaw. He hated hearing her beg. At 14, he was determined to help however he could, whether it meant skipping lunch to save money or picking up extra hours at Mr. Carl's garage. The park loomed ahead, its leafy trees swaying slightly in the summer breeze. Usually, Davy would avoid it. It was where kids from the local private school gathered, their laughter and carefree chatter a stark reminder of everything he didn't have. But today, his route to the garage took him right past it. He tightened his grip on his backpack and kept his head down. As he walked, a familiar voice rang out, laced with mockery. "Hey, Parker. Nice shoes." Davy's face burned as he looked up. A group of boys stood by the basketball court, their pristine uniforms and spotless sneakers a sharp contrast to his threadbare clothes. The leader, Tommy, smirked, tossing a ball casually between his hands. "What happened? Your mom forget to pay for the rest of your outfit?" The laughter that followed stung, but Davy refused to react. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets and quickened his pace, focusing on the ground. The sound of their taunts faded as he reached the edge of the park. He let out a breath, trying to shake off the humiliation. There was no point wasting energy on boys like Tommy. He had bigger problems to worry about. At the far end of the park, he spotted an elderly man sitting alone on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. The man's clothes were rumpled, his white hair sticking up in tufts as if he'd been in the wind too long. He stared blankly into the distance, his hands resting limply on his lap. Something about him seemed off. Davy hesitated. He glanced at his watch. He was already running late for the garage. But something pulled him toward the bench. The man looked so lost, so vulnerable. "Hey," Davy said cautiously as he approached. "Are you okay, sir?" The man turned his head slowly, his cloudy eyes struggling to focus. He opened his mouth but said nothing, his expression blank. Davy frowned. He looked down at the lunch bag in his hand. It wasn't much, just a peanut butter sandwich his mom had managed to scrape together. His stomach growled at the thought, but he ignored it. "You hungry?" he asked, holding out the sandwich. The man blinked, his gaze shifting to the food. His lips quivered, and a faint smile broke through the fog on his face. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice raspy. Davy sat down beside him, unwrapping the sandwich and handing it over. The man took it gingerly, like it was a rare treasure. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park fading into the background. Davy wasn't sure what else to say, so he just stayed there, keeping the man company. After a while, a shadow fell over them. Davy looked up to see a tall man in a crisp suit, his face lined with worry. "Dad," the man exclaimed, rushing forward. The elderly man looked up, his eyes lighting up faintly. "Oh, hello, son." The man in the suit knelt beside him, his hands trembling as he touched his father's shoulder. "I've been looking everywhere for you," he said, his voice thick with relief. Then his gaze shifted to Davy, taking in the scene, the boy with worn shoes and a patched backpack sitting beside his father, a half-eaten sandwich in the old man's hands. "Were you with him this whole time?" the man asked, his tone softening. Davy nodded. He looked lost. "I just wanted to help." For a moment, the man in the suit said nothing. Then he reached out and grasped Davy's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Davy shrugged, feeling awkward under the man's intense gaze. "It's nothing," he mumbled. But the man shook his head. "No, it's not nothing. You showed kindness when you didn't have to. That matters." He stood, helping his father to his feet. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you home." Davy watched as they walked away, the man's arm protectively around his father's shoulders. He stayed on the bench for a while, staring at the empty wrapper in his hands. His stomach growled again, but he didn't regret giving up his lunch. Somehow, it felt like he'd done something right. By the time he got home that evening, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over their tiny house. Inside, his mother sat at the kitchen table, her face lined with worry, as she sorted through a pile of bills. She looked up as he walked in, her expression softening. "You're late," she said gently. "Yeah," Davy replied, dropping his backpack by the door. "I stopped to help someone." His mother's tired eyes lit up with a flicker of pride. "That's just like you," she said with a small smile. "Always helping." Davy nodded, but he didn't tell her about the old man or the man in the suit. It felt too strange, too out of place in their world of overdue bills and endless struggles. Instead, he sat down and helped her sort the papers, his mind still replaying the man's words. "You showed kindness when you didn't have to." As he climbed into bed that night, Davy felt a faint glimmer of hope, like a single star in an otherwise dark sky. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could change. A mysterious visitor. The next morning arrived too quickly for Davy, and the small house was already alive with the quiet movements of his mother preparing for her day. The electricity still hadn't been restored, so she moved by the faint light streaming through the window, her face set in a mask of determination. Davy rose from his thin mattress and stretched, his joints aching slightly from the previous day's labor at the garage. He rubbed his eyes and made his way to the kitchen, where his mother stood over the stove, boiling water on their battered old gas burner. "Morning, Ma," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning, sweetheart," she replied, her tone tired but kind. She placed a small plate on the table, a single piece of toast, and a bit of butter scraped from the bottom of the container. "Eat this before school. I know it's not much, but I'll try to get something better for dinner." Davy nodded, sitting down and nibbling at the toast. The dryness of the bread made his throat itch, but he didn't complain. He knew how hard his mother worked to make ends meet, and he wasn't about to add to her worries. As he chewed, his mind drifted back to the old man in the park and the mysterious man in the suit. He replayed the scene over and over, the man's gratitude and the strange sense of importance in his words. "You showed kindness when you didn't have to." The phrase echoed in his mind, filling him with a mix of pride and uncertainty. "Ma," Davy said suddenly, setting down his toast. "Do you think helping someone can change things? Like, really change things?" His mother paused, her hand stilling over the stove. She turned to look at him, her expression soft but guarded. "Kindness always matters, Davy. Sometimes it changes the person you help. Sometimes it changes you. But it's not always easy to see how." He nodded, her words sinking in. He wasn't sure what he had expected her to say, but her response gave him a little comfort. He finished his toast in silence, grabbed his patched-up backpack, and headed out the door. The walk to school was uneventful, though Davy couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was about to happen. The air seemed different that morning, heavier somehow, as if carrying the weight of unspoken promises. He passed the park, glancing at the bench where he'd met the old man, but it was empty. A couple of pigeons fluttered by, pecking at crumbs on the ground. School was the same as always, a dull routine of lessons he struggled to focus on and classmates who mostly ignored him. By lunchtime, his stomach was growling loudly, but he didn't have anything to eat. He'd skipped packing a lunch, knowing there wasn't much at home to bring. Instead, he wandered outside and sat under a tree, watching the other kids laugh and share sandwiches, chips, and juice boxes. He was startled out of his thoughts by the loud honk of a car horn. The sound was out of place here, where most vehicles were rusty sedans or old pickup trucks. Davy stood up, craning his neck to see where the noise was coming from. A sleek black luxury car was parked at the edge of the schoolyard, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Davy's stomach tightened. He recognized it immediately. It was the same car the man in the suit had driven yesterday. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped the man, looking just as sharp as before in a tailored gray suit. He scanned the schoolyard, his eyes locking on Davy with startling precision. Without hesitation, he began walking toward him. Davy froze, his heart pounding. Whispers rippled through the crowd of students as they noticed the expensive car and the well-dressed man striding confidently across the grass. A few kids pointed, their voices carrying snippets of curiosity and disbelief. "Who's that? What's he doing here? Isn't that Parker?" The man reached Davy and stopped a few feet away, his expression warm but serious. "Davy Parker?" he asked. Davy nodded, his mouth dry. "Ah, yeah, that's me." The man smiled faintly and extended a hand. "It's good to see you again. I'm Alan Crawford. We met yesterday at the park." Davy hesitated for a moment before shaking the man's hand, his grip firm despite his nerves. "I remember," he said. What are you doing here?" Mr. Crawford glanced around, noting the curious stares of the other students. "I'd like to talk to you about something important. Is there somewhere more private we can go?" Davy blinked, his mind racing. I guess, the principal's office." Mr. Crawford nodded. "Lead the way." Inside the principal's office, the air was cooler, the hum of an old fan filling the silence. Mr. Crawford sat across from Davy at the small conference table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "I'll get straight to the point," he began. "Yesterday, you helped my father in a way that most people wouldn't have. You showed compassion, patience, and maturity beyond your years. That's not something I see often." Davy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It wasn't a big deal," he muttered. "I just saw he needed help." "That's exactly why it matters," Mr. Crawford replied. "You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's rare." Davy didn't know how to respond. He stared down at his hands, feeling a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. Mr. Crawford continued, his tone softening. "When I got home yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking about you and what you did. I started asking myself how I could return that kindness, and I realized I could help you and your family." Davy's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Help us? How?" Mr. Crawford smiled. "I'd like to offer your mother a job at my company. It's nothing extravagant, but it pays well and comes with benefits. I know how hard it is to make ends meet, especially in times like these. This could be a fresh start for her, and for you." Davy's heart raced. It sounded too good to be true. A job. "For my mom?" "Yes," Mr. Crawford said. "And I'd like to help you too. I noticed you were walking yesterday. Do you have a bike or anything to get around?" Davy shook his head, still stunned. "No, sir." "Then we'll fix that. I'll make sure you have the tools you need to succeed, at school and beyond. It's the least I can do for someone who's already done so much." For a moment, Davy couldn't speak. The weight of Mr. Crawford's words settled over him, a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing all this for us?" Mr. Crawford's expression softened. "Because I've been where you are, Davy. I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the odds are stacked against you. Someone helped me once when I needed it most, and now it's my turn to pay it forward." Davy's throat tightened, and he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mr. Crawford replied, standing and placing a hand on Davy's shoulder. "Just keep being the kind of person you were yesterday. That's all I ask." As Davy left the office, His mind reeled with everything that had just happened. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so bleak. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. A spark of hope. Davy walked home that afternoon in a daze, the events of the day swirling in his mind like a whirlwind. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays over the cracked sidewalks, but Davy barely noticed. His thoughts were entirely consumed by Mr. Crawford's visit to the school and his extraordinary offer. The idea of his mother getting a job that paid well and came with benefits seemed almost surreal. He'd grown used to the daily struggle, the constant balancing act of overdue bills and limited food. The possibility of relief felt like a distant dream suddenly made tangible. But more than anything, Davy worried how his mother would react. She wasn't the type to accept charity or handouts, no matter how desperate their situation. When he reached the house, the sight of their modest, run-down home brought him back to reality. The front door hung slightly ajar, its chipped paint a testament to years of neglect. The faint hum of conversation drifted through the open doorway, and Davy's pulse quickened. Someone was inside. He stepped in cautiously, his worn sneakers scraping against the floor. In the living room, his mother sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, in the rickety armchair that wobbled if you leaned too far back, sat Mr. Crawford. He had shed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, his demeanor relaxed but professional. Davy froze in the doorway, unsure if he should interrupt. His mother noticed him first, her eyes darting to him with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Davy," she said, her voice steady but tinged with tension. Mr. Crawford was just explaining his offer. Davy glanced at Mr. Crawford, who smiled warmly. "Ah, Davy, good to see you again. I thought it was best to come by and speak with your mother directly." Davy nodded, stepping further into the room. He dropped his backpack by the wall and perched on the armrest of the couch beside his mother. "Ma, he means it. He really wants to help." His mother exhaled sharply, her gaze shifting between Davy and Mr. Crawford. "It's not that I don't appreciate the gesture," she said, her voice firm. "But I've never taken anything I didn't earn. I don't want my kids thinking we can rely on someone else to fix our problems." "It's not charity," Mr. Crawford said gently. "It's an opportunity. You'll be working hard, earning every cent. My company needs someone reliable, and from what I've seen, you're exactly the type of person I'm looking for." Davy's mother hesitated, her fingers tightening around each other. "What kind of job are we talking about?" "Administrative work," Mr. Crawford replied. "Filing, organizing schedules, some light data entry. I'll provide training, and you'll have flexible hours to make sure you can still take care of your family. And I'm willing to start you at a salary that reflects your effort and dedication." Davy's heart pounded as he watched his mother process the information. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the weight of her pride battling against the needs of her family. Finally, she let out a long sigh and looked at Mr. Crawford directly. "I'll take the job," she said, her voice steady. "But on one condition. If I'm not pulling my weight, you let me know. I won't take advantage of your kindness." Mr. Crawford's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's more than fair. I have no doubt you'll do an excellent job." Relief flooded through Davy, and he couldn't help the small smile that crept onto his face. His mother glanced at him and gave his knee a light squeeze, as if to say, "This is for us." The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. True to his word, Mr. Crawford arranged everything swiftly. His mother started work the very next week, and Davy could see the difference it made almost immediately. For the first time in years, she seemed lighter, her shoulders no longer slumped under the weight of endless worry. She even hummed softly while preparing breakfast, a sound Davy hadn't heard in a long time. Meanwhile, Davy's own life began to shift in unexpected ways. On his third day back at school after meeting Mr. Crawford, he was surprised to find a brand new bicycle waiting for him at the school gate. It was sleek and shiny, with a sturdy frame and tires that practically begged to hit the pavement. A note taped to the handlebars read, "For Davy, Every journey needs a good start. Best, Alan Crawford. Davy couldn't believe it. He ran his fingers over the handlebars, marveling at the craftsmanship. It was more than just a bike. It was freedom. The ability to get to school and work faster, to save time and energy for the things that mattered most. Nice ride, Parker. A voice called out, snapping Davy from his thoughts. He turned to see Tommy, the rich kid who had mocked him in the park, striding over with a smug grin. "Where'd you steal it from?" Davy's chest tightened, but this time he didn't look away. He straightened his back and met Tommy's gaze head-on. "I didn't steal it," he said firmly. "Someone gave it to me, because I earned it." Tommy raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by Davy's confidence. "Whatever," he muttered, walking away. Davy watched him go, feeling a spark of satisfaction. For once, he didn't feel small or ashamed. He felt proud. At home, things continued to improve. The electricity was restored by the end of the month, and with his mother's new income, they were able to catch up on rent and even set aside a little for emergencies. Davy noticed the change in his siblings, too. His younger sister Maria no longer asked if the lights would come back on, and his brother Luke, who had been quiet and withdrawn, started laughing again during dinner. One evening, as they sat around the table eating spaghetti, a rare treat, his mother looked at him with a soft smile. "You know, Davy," she said, "none of this would have happened without you." Davy blinked, surprised. "Me? What did I do?" "You showed kindness," she replied. "To that man in the park. To Mr. Crawford's father. You didn't think twice about helping someone in need, even when you didn't have much to give. And because of that, he helped us." Davy looked down at his plate, his cheeks warming. "I just did what felt right. And that's why it mattered," his mother said. "Kindness has a way of coming back to you when you least expect it." Her words stayed with him long after dinner, replaying in his mind as he lay in bed. He thought about the old man in the park, the way he'd smiled when Davy handed him the sandwich. He thought about Mr. Crawford's determination to help their family and the changes that had followed. For the first time in his life, Davy began to believe that one small act of kindness could indeed change the course of everything. Ripples of change. Davy's life slowly shifted into a rhythm he hadn't known before, a rhythm of stability and quiet optimism. His mother woke up early each morning, dressed in her neatly pressed blouse and slacks, and left for her job at Mr. Crawford's office. Her posture was different now, straighter, her steps quicker, as though some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The house itself seemed to reflect the change. Though still small and worn, it no longer felt suffocating. The flickering overhead light in the kitchen had been replaced. The ancient stove worked better now, thanks to a repairman his mother had finally been able to call. Even the sagging front steps had been patched up with wood Davy had scavenged from the garage. At school, Davy's newfound confidence didn't go unnoticed. His classmates, who had once ignored him or mocked his shabby clothes, now seemed intrigued by his sudden transformation. He still wasn't one of the popular kids, but he carried himself differently, and that made them take notice. Even Tommy, the boy who had teased him relentlessly, seemed to leave him alone now, his smirks replaced with something closer to begrudging respect. One crisp Friday afternoon, Davy biked home from school, his legs pumping as the wind rushed past him. The bike had quickly become his favorite possession. It wasn't just a tool for getting around. It was a symbol of how far he and his family had come. As he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed something unusual. A sleek black car parked in front of his house. Davy's heart skipped a beat. It was Mr. Crawford's car. He parked his bike by the steps and hurried inside. The door creaked open to reveal his mother sitting at the kitchen table with Mr. Crawford. They both looked up as Davy entered. His mother smiled warmly, but there was a hint of something else in her expression. Excitement, maybe, or pride. "Hi, Davy," Mr. Crawford said, standing and extending a hand. "Good to see you." "You too, sir," Davy replied, shaking his hand. He looked at his mother, his eyebrows knitting together. "What's going on?" His mother gestured to the seat beside her. "Come sit down, sweetheart. Mr. Crawford has something to share with us." Curiosity gnawed Davy as he slid into the chair. Mr. Crawford took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "First, I want to tell you how proud I am of both of you," he began. "Your mother has been doing an incredible job at the office. Better than I even hoped. She's organized, efficient, and a natural leader. In fact," he paused, a smile spreading across his face, "I've decided to promote her to office manager." Davy's eyes widened, and he turned to his mother, who was blushing furiously. "Ma, that's amazing." She gave a small laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." "Thank you, Mr. Crawford." "You've earned it," Mr. Crawford replied. "And it comes with a raise, of course. But that's not the only reason I'm here." Davy's stomach flipped. There was more. Mr. Crawford looked at Davy now, his expression serious but kind. "Davy, you've been working hard too. Carl at the garage speaks very highly of you. He says you're one of the most reliable workers he's ever had." Davy felt his cheeks warm. "I just do what I can." "That's exactly the kind of attitude that makes a difference," Mr. Crawford said, "which is why I want to offer you something, a scholarship to a summer program for young leaders." Davy blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. "A scholarship?" "Yes," Mr. Crawford said. "It's a program that helps teens like you develop skills in leadership, problem-solving, and community service. It's fully funded, so you wouldn't have to worry about costs. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Davy's throat felt tight. He'd never thought of himself as a leader, but the idea of being part of something bigger, of learning how to make a real difference, it filled him with a sense of possibility he hadn't dared to imagine. I don't know," he stammered. "I've never done anything like that before." "That's the point," Mr. Crawford said with a grin. "It's about stepping out of your comfort zone, learning and growing. You've already proven you have the heart for it. Now it's time to build the skills." Davy looked at his mother, who was watching him with an expression of quiet encouragement. "What do you think, man?" he asked. She reached over and placed a hand on his. "I think you should go for it, Davy. You've worked so hard, and you deserve this chance. I'll support you every step of the way." The lump in Davy's throat grew, and he nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll do it." Over the next few weeks, Davy's life became a whirlwind of preparation. The program required essays, forms, and a recommendation letter, which Mr. Crawford helped him obtain. His mother pitched in too, sitting beside him at the kitchen table as they pored over the paperwork. It was the first time in a long time that Davy had felt truly excited about the future. At school, word spread about the scholarship, and for the first time, Davy found himself at the center of attention, not for his worn clothes or old shoes, but for something positive. Even Tommy, who had always been a thorn in his side, approached him one day after class. "Hey, Parker," he said, his tone unusually neutral. "I heard about that leadership thing. That's cool." Davy raised an eyebrow, unsure if this was another trick. But Tommy looked sincere, and after a moment, Davy nodded. "Thanks." Tommy hesitated, then added, "Maybe you'll show everyone that even people like you can make it." The words could have been an insult, but for once, Davy didn't take them that way. Instead, he saw it as a challenge, a reminder that he had the power to change the way people saw him and his family. The day Davy left for the program, his mother and siblings gathered on the front steps to see him off. His new bike had been temporarily replaced by a battered suitcase and a backpack filled with the essentials they'd scraped together. Mr. Crawford had offered to drive him to the program's headquarters, and his sleek car sat idling at the curb. As Davy hugged his mother goodbye, he felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill. "I'll make you proud, Ma," he said, his voice thick. "You already have," she whispered, holding him tightly. "Now go show the world what you're made of." Davy nodded, blinking back the tears as he climbed into the car. As they pulled away, he looked back at his family, their faces shining with pride and hope. For the first time in his life, Davy felt like he was stepping into a future that wasn't defined by struggle and limitations. Instead, it was filled with possibility, with a path forged by the small act of kindness that had started it all. The journey begins. The drive to the summer leadership program was a mix of excitement and nerves for Davy. The car hummed smoothly along the highway as Mr. Crawford expertly navigated the winding roads. The city gave way to rolling hills, their greenery dotted with small towns and the occasional farmhouse. Davy stared out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. "You're quiet," Mr. Crawford said, glancing at him briefly. "Nervous?" Davy nodded, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. "A little. I've never done anything like this before." "That's a good thing," Mr. Crawford replied with a smile. "Growth doesn't happen when you stay in your comfort zone. You're going to meet people from all over, learn new skills, and discover things about yourself you didn't even know were there." Davy tried to imagine it. A room full of kids like him, but different. Kids who might not understand what it was like to go without, to scrape by with just enough. He wondered if he would fit in or if they'd see right through him. See the boy with patched clothes and a history of struggle. "You've already proven you're ready for this," Mr. Crawford added. "Remember, they chose you for a reason." Davy nodded, his confidence bolstered by the man's words. The car crested a hill, and in the distance, he spotted the program's headquarters, a sprawling campus with modern buildings surrounded by lush gardens and fields. It looked like something out of a brochure, pristine and polished. The car rolled up to the main entrance, where other families were dropping off their children. Davy saw kids pulling shiny suitcases, their parents hugging them goodbye. He felt a pang of longing as he thought of his mother and siblings, but he pushed it aside. This was his chance to make them proud. As they stepped out of the car, a cheerful woman in a blue polo shirt approached them. "Welcome to the Rising Leaders Program," she said brightly, handing Davy a folder. "This has your schedule, room assignment, and a map of the campus. You must be David Parker." Yeah, but I go by Davy," he replied, feeling a little overwhelmed. "Great to meet you, Davy. My name's Jenna, and I'll be one of your program coordinators. If you have any questions, just ask." Jenna led them through the main building, which buzzed with activity. Other students milled about, chatting excitedly and exploring the campus. Davy clutched his folder tightly, feeling like a fish out of water. They stopped at a dormitory, where Jenna handed him a key. "This will be your home for the next 3 weeks," she said with a smile. "Your roommate should be arriving soon. Get settled, and we'll see you at the orientation later." Davy turned to Mr. Crawford, who placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to do great, Davy. Remember why you're here, and don't forget, you're not alone in this." Davy nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you, sir, for everything." With a final encouraging smile, Mr. Crawford left, and Davy was alone. The dorm room was small but clean, with 2 twin beds, a pair of desks, and a window overlooking the campus gardens. Davy claimed the bed closest to the window and began unpacking. His belongings were modest: a few changes of clothes, a notebook, and a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, his favorite book, gifted to him by his mother. As he was tucking his things into the small dresser, the door burst open, and a tall boy with curly hair and an infectious grin strode in, dragging a suitcase behind him. "Hey," the boy said, dropping his bag. "You must be Davy. I'm Marcus." Davy stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond to the boy's easy confidence. "Yeah, that's me. Nice to meet you." Marcus flopped onto the other bed, stretching out with a sigh. "Man, this place is fancy. My mom wouldn't stop taking pictures on the way in. She's convinced I'm going to be president someday." He laughed, then looked at Davy. "What about you? Where are you from?" Just a small town outside the city," Davy said, avoiding specifics. He wasn't sure how much to share. Cool, cool, Marcus said, sitting up. You ever done anything like this before? Davy shook his head. No, this is all new to me. Same here, Marcus admitted, though he didn't seem nervous about it. Guess we'll figure it out together. For the first time, Davy felt a small sense of relief. Marcus's friendliness was disarming, and Davy decided to let his guard down a little. The orientation that evening was held in a large auditorium filled with rows of chairs. Students from all over the country filled the seats, their voices creating a steady hum of anticipation. Davy and Marcus sat near the back, where they could observe without drawing too much attention. The program director, a charismatic man named Mr. Steen, took the stage and welcomed everyone with a speech about leadership, resilience, and the importance of giving back to their communities. Davy found himself leaning forward, captivated by the man's words. You are here because you've shown potential, Mr. Steen said, his voice commanding yet warm. But potential means nothing if it isn't cultivated. Over the next 3 weeks, you'll be challenged, pushed out of your comfort zones, and taught the skills to turn that potential into action. Leadership isn't about power. It's about service. It's about lifting others as you rise. Davy's chest tightened. The words resonated deeply with him, reminding him of the moment he offered his sandwich to the old man in the park. He hadn't thought of it as leadership then, but maybe it was. The days that followed were intense. The program was a mix of workshops, team-building exercises, and community projects. Davy found himself working alongside kids who came from very different backgrounds, some wealthy, some middle class, and a few who, like him, knew what it was like to struggle. At first, he felt out of place. He didn't have the polished manners or expensive clothes that many of the other students seemed to take for granted. But as the days went on, he realized something. It didn't matter. What mattered was how he treated people, how he contributed to the group, and how he rose to each challenge. During one workshop on communication, the instructor asked them to share a moment when they'd made a difference in someone's life. Davy hesitated at first, but then he found himself recounting the story of the old man in the park. As he spoke, the room grew quiet, the other students listening intently. When he finished, there was a pause, and then the instructor smiled. That's leadership, Davy, she said. You acted when others might have walked away. Never underestimate the power of small actions. For the first time, Davy felt like he belonged. His story wasn't just his own. It was a reminder to everyone in the room that leadership started with kindness. As the program continued, Davy grew in ways he hadn't expected. He learned to speak up, to share his ideas confidently, and to work with others toward common goals. By the time the 3 weeks were over, he felt like a different person, stronger, more capable, and ready to take on the world. On the final day, as the students gathered for the closing ceremony, Davy sat with Marcus, his heart full. He thought of his mother and siblings, of Mr. Crawford, and of the small act of kindness that had brought him here. He realized now that every step he'd taken, no matter how small, had been building toward this moment. When the ceremony ended and he stood with his certificate in hand, Davy knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Bringing it home. The ride back home was different from the one that had brought Davy to the leadership program 3 weeks earlier. Though the same sleek black car carried him through the winding roads, Davy felt like an entirely new person. Confidence radiated from him, not in an arrogant way, but in the quiet assurance that he had something valuable to offer the world. Next to him in the passenger seat, Mr. Crawford smiled as he drove. "You're awfully quiet, Davy," he remarked, his voice warm. Pondering the mysteries of life, or just tired from all that learning? Davy chuckled. "A little of both, I guess. It feels like. A lot happened, you know. Like I went to that program one person and came back someone else. That's how it's supposed to feel," Mr. Crawford said. "Growth always feels like stepping into new shoes at first. Strange, maybe a little uncomfortable, But once you break them in, you realize you can walk farther than you ever thought possible. Davy nodded, turning to watch the familiar streets of his neighborhood come into view. His house sat at the end of the block, the small front yard now neatly trimmed and the sagging steps repaired. It wasn't just the house that looked different, though. It was the energy of the place. Where there had once been a sense of struggle and resignation, there was now hope and determination. As the car pulled up to the curb, Davy's siblings burst out of the front door, their laughter ringing through the air. Maria, his younger sister, waved frantically, while Luke trailed behind her, trying to play it cool but failing miserably. "Davy!" Maria yelled, running up to the car as Davy stepped out. She threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him off balance. "We missed you so much." Luke grinned, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, man, it's been weird without you." Davy laughed, ruffling Luke's hair. "I missed you guys too. What's been going on here?" "Lots," Maria said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the house. "Mom's been so busy with her new job, and Luke fixed his bike all by himself, and oh, you have to see what she did to the kitchen." Davy let her drag him inside, where his mother was waiting by the door. She looked radiant, her hair neatly pinned back and her eyes bright with pride. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "Thanks, Ma," Davy replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to be back." As Maria chattered on about the changes in the house, Davy couldn't help but notice the small but meaningful upgrades. The kitchen now had new curtains, a small vase of fresh flowers on the table, and a shiny, functional toaster, a far cry from the broken appliances they'd once struggled with. Even the living room looked cozier, with a second-hand rug and a throw blanket draped over the old couch. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Davy shared stories from the program. He told them about Marcus, the workshops, and the community project they had completed, designing a garden for a local shelter. His siblings listened wide-eyed, while his mother smiled softly, pride evident in her expression. "You're going to do great things, Davy," she said when he finished. "I've always known it." Davy looked down at his plate, his cheeks flushing. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ma. Without all of you. You've always believed in me, even when I wasn't sure I could do anything." Maria leaned over and gave him a playful shove. "Of course we believe in you. You're the best big brother ever." Luke nodded solemnly. "Yeah, and you're like the smartest person I know." Davy laughed, the warmth of their words filling him with gratitude. "Thanks, you guys. That means a lot." The next morning, Davy woke early, unable to shake the feeling that he needed to do something more. The program had taught him that leadership wasn't just about personal growth. It was about using your skills and knowledge to make a difference. He looked around his neighborhood as he stepped outside, taking in the crumbling sidewalks, overgrown yards, and faded paint on houses. An idea began to form in his mind. He hopped on his bike and rode to Mr. Carl's garage, where the familiar smell of oil and grease greeted him. Carl was underneath an old pickup truck, his legs sticking out as he tinkered with the engine. "Hey, Davy," Carl called out, sliding out from under the truck. "Back from your fancy program, huh? You learn how to fix a car with just your mind." Davy grinned. "Not quite, but I learned some other things. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Carl wiped his hands on a rag and raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" Davy explained his idea, a neighborhood improvement project that would bring people together to clean up the streets, fix broken fences, and create a community garden. "I was thinking we could start small," he said. "Just a few houses at first. Maybe even use the empty lot down the street for the garden." Carl listened, nodding thoughtfully. "Sounds ambitious," he said. "But I like it. This neighborhood could use some TLC. You sure you're ready to take on something this big?" Davy hesitated, then nodded firmly. "Yeah, I think I am." Over the next few weeks, Davy threw himself into the project. He visited neighbors, explaining his vision and asking for their support. To his surprise, many were eager to help. Families offered tools, seeds, and spare paint, while others volunteered their time. Even Tommy, the boy who had once mocked him, showed up with a group of friends, ready to pitch in. The project became a community effort, with people of all ages working side by side. The empty lot was transformed into a vibrant garden, complete with rows of vegetables, colorful flowers, and a small seating area. Broken fences were mended, trash was cleared, and the neighborhood began to feel alive again. Davy found himself stepping into a leadership role naturally, coordinating tasks, motivating volunteers, and solving problems as they arose. He realized that everything he'd learned at the leadership program was coming into play, not just the skills, but the mindset of service and collaboration. On the day the project was completed, the neighborhood held a small celebration in the garden. Tables were set up with food and drinks, and the air buzzed with laughter and conversation. Davy stood at the edge of the garden, taking it all in, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Mr. Crawford appeared beside him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've done something incredible here, Davy." "It wasn't just me," Davy said. "Everyone came together to make this happen." "That's the mark of a true leader," Mr. Crawford replied. "You inspired them to believe in something bigger than themselves." Davy looked around at the smiling faces of his neighbors, his family sitting together under the shade of a tree. For the first time, he felt like he truly understood what it meant to make a difference. And it had all started with a single act of kindness in the park. As the sun set over the garden that evening, Davy realized that his journey was far from over. But now, he knew he had the strength, the tools, and the support to face whatever came next. His future, like the garden before him, was full of growth and possibility, and he couldn't wait to see where it would take him. Sowing seeds for the future. The garden became more than just a project. It was a symbol of transformation. Neighbors who had once barely exchanged greetings now worked together to maintain it, sharing tips on growing vegetables and flowers. Children laughed as they helped water plants or chased butterflies, and elderly residents found a peaceful place to sit and reminisce. For Davy, the garden was proof that change could happen, even in the most unlikely places. Life at home had improved significantly as well. With his mother's promotion, the Parker family no longer had to juggle bills to keep the lights on. Maria and Luke had started excelling in school, inspired by Davy's hard work and newfound confidence. The house, though still modest, felt warm and alive, no longer weighed down by constant worry. But Davy knew his work wasn't done. The leadership program had taught him that true leaders think beyond their immediate surroundings. As he looked out at the neighborhood, he saw not just the improvements they had made, but the challenges that still remained: crumbling sidewalks, abandoned lots, and families still struggling to get by. One crisp autumn morning, Davy sat at the small desk in his room, sketching out ideas in his notebook. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Maria, her dark eyes wide with excitement. "Davy, there's someone at the door for you," she said, practically bouncing on her toes. "Who is it?" he asked, standing and stretching. "I don't know, but they're wearing a suit." Davy's heart skipped a beat. He followed Maria to the front door, where Mr. Crawford stood with a wide smile and a leather portfolio under his arm. "Good morning, Davy," Mr. Crawford said, stepping inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Davy replied, shaking his hand. "What brings you here?" "I've been keeping an eye on your progress," Mr. Crawford said, gesturing toward the garden visible through the window. "What you've done here is remarkable. You've turned this neighborhood into a real community." Davy flushed slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It wasn't just me. Everyone pitched in." "That's the hallmark of great leadership," Mr. Crawford said. "And that's why I'm here. I've been thinking about ways to support what you're doing and help you expand your impact." Davy tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mr. Crawford opened his portfolio and pulled out a stack of papers. I want to fund a formal initiative, something bigger than just one garden. A program that helps young leaders like you transform their communities. You'd be the face of it, Davy, the first project leader. Davy's eyes widened as he scanned the papers, which outlined plans for funding community projects, organizing workshops, and creating a network of young leaders across the city. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Completely," Mr. Crawford replied. "This program would give you access to resources, mentorship, and the chance to inspire others the way you've inspired your neighborhood. What do you think?" Davy's mind raced. The idea was overwhelming, but also thrilling. He thought about the kids in his community who deserved better opportunities, the families who could benefit from something like this. Finally, he looked up and met Mr. Crawford's gaze. "I think it's incredible," he said, "and I'd be honored to be part of it." The weeks that followed were a blur of planning and meetings. Mr. Crawford introduced Davy to his team, a group of professionals who specialized in community development and youth engagement. They worked closely with Davy to design the initiative, which they named Roots to Rise, a nod to the way strong roots could lead to flourishing growth. The program launched with a citywide event held in the community garden, which had become the heart of the neighborhood. Davy stood on a small stage, nervously clutching the microphone as he prepared to address the crowd. His mother, siblings, and neighbors were all there, along with local officials, reporters, and students from the leadership program. Taking a deep breath, Davy began. "A few months ago, I never would have imagined standing here," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Back then, I thought leadership was something reserved for people who already had everything figured out. But I've learned that leadership starts with small actions, acts of kindness, service, and the courage to believe in something better." He glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. "This garden started as a simple idea, but it grew into something bigger because we worked together. And now, with Roots to Rise, I hope we can bring that same spirit to other neighborhoods, to other people who just need a little support to make a big difference." The crowd erupted into applause, and Davy felt a surge of pride and gratitude. As he stepped off the stage, he was surrounded by well-wishers, neighbors thanking him, kids asking how they could get involved, and reporters eager to share his story. Roots to Rise quickly gained momentum. The program funded projects across the city, from park cleanups to after-school tutoring initiatives. Davy visited each site, meeting with local leaders and offering guidance based on his own experiences. He found himself growing not just as a leader, but as a mentor, helping others discover their own potential. One of the most rewarding moments came when Tommy, the boy who had once teased Davy, approached him with an idea for a youth basketball league. "I want to give kids something positive to do after school," Tommy said, his tone earnest. "Do you think Roots to Rise could help?" Davy smiled. "Absolutely. Let's make it happen." The league became one of the program's most popular initiatives, and Tommy proved to be a natural leader. Seeing the transformation in his former bully reminded Davy of the power of second chances and the importance of believing in people. As the months turned into a year, Davy's impact continued to grow. He was invited to speak at schools, conferences, and even city council meetings, sharing his story and advocating for community-driven change. Each time, he spoke from the heart, never forgetting the simple act of kindness that had set everything in motion. At home, life was better than ever. His mother's hard work at Mr. Crawford's company had earned her a reputation as one of their most dedicated employees, and she was even saving for Maria and Luke's future. The Parker family, once defined by struggle, now stood as a testament to resilience and the power of hope. One evening, as Davy stood in the garden watching the sunset, his mother joined him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done so much, Davy, more than I ever dreamed possible." He smiled, looking out at the rows of plants swaying gently in the breeze. "It all started with that sandwich, Ma. Just one little thing." His mother nodded. "And look how far that one little thing has taken you." Davy gazed at the horizon, his heart full. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it. Because now, he understood that even the smallest acts could create ripples that stretched far and wide. And he was just getting started. A new horizon. Life in the neighborhood had transformed, and the success of Roots to Rise had far exceeded Davy's wildest dreams. But with success came new challenges. Requests for projects poured in from other neighborhoods, some in far worse condition than his own. Davy quickly realized that running a growing program was no small feat. He needed to learn how to manage people, resources, and expectations, all while staying true to the mission that had inspired him. On a chilly winter morning, Davy sat at the kitchen table, poring over a stack of letters and proposals. Each one told a story of a community in need, a school playground overrun with weeds, a youth center on the verge of closing, an elderly couple unable to repair their leaky roof. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but it was also what motivated him to keep going. His mother walked into the room, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. "You've been at this all morning," she said, setting the mug in front of him. "Don't forget to take a break once in a while." Davy smiled up at her. "I'm okay, Ma. Just trying to figure out how to help all these people." She sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You've always had a big heart, Davy. But remember, you can't do everything on your own. Sometimes, the best leaders know when to ask for help." Her words stayed with him as he continued his work that day. He realized she was right. If Roots to Rise was going to keep growing, he couldn't carry the burden alone. He needed a team of dedicated people who shared his vision. Over the next few weeks, Davy began recruiting volunteers and partners to help expand the program. He reached out to local schools, community centers, and small businesses, asking for support. He even approached his old boss, Mr. Carl, who enthusiastically agreed to sponsor projects involving repairs and construction. "Anything you need, kid," Mr. Carl said, clapping Davy on the back. "You've got a good thing going here, and I'm proud to be a part of it." Among the new recruits was Marcus, his roommate from the leadership program. Marcus brought fresh energy and ideas to the team, and his natural charisma made him an excellent spokesperson for the initiative. "Man, I always knew you were going to do something big," Marcus said one afternoon as they brainstormed ideas for upcoming projects. "But this is next level. We're building something that's going to last." Davy grinned. "I couldn't do it without you, Marcus, or without everyone who's been willing to step up." Together, they worked to establish a formal structure for Roots to Rise, complete with regional chapters and a mentorship program for young leaders. Each chapter was tasked with identifying the specific needs of its community and finding creative ways to address them. One of the first regional chapters was launched in a struggling neighborhood on the other side of the city. Davy visited the site personally, meeting with the local team and listening to their stories. Among them was a girl named Amara, a quiet but determined 16-year-old who had taken it upon herself to start a small food pantry out of her garage. "We don't have much," Amara explained, showing him the neatly arranged shelves of canned goods and dry food. "But there are a lot of families around here who go hungry. I just want to help." Davy saw himself in her, someone who cared deeply about their community and was willing to take action, even with limited resources. "You're already making a huge difference," he told her. "And with Roots to Rise, we can help you do even more." Under the program, Amara's food pantry expanded into a full-fledged community center, complete with a learning space for kids, a small garden, and a weekly meal distribution program. Watching her thrive as a leader was one of Davy's proudest moments. As Roots to Rise grew, so did its reputation. News outlets began covering the program's successes, and Davy was invited to speak at events and conferences. Each time he took the stage, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement, but he always grounded himself in the story that had started it all. The day he gave his sandwich to an old man in the park. "I didn't know it at the time," he often said, "but that small act of kindness set off a chain reaction. It reminded me that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how little we think we have to give. One day, after a particularly inspiring talk at a citywide leadership summit, Davy was approached by a woman in her late 40s, her eyes bright with admiration. "Your story reminds me of my father," she said, holding out her hand. "He had Alzheimer's, and there were so many times when strangers showed him kindness. People like you gave me hope when I thought all was lost." Davy shook her hand, moved by her words. "Thank you for sharing that. It means a lot to me. I want to help," she added. "I work for a foundation that funds grassroots initiatives like yours. Let's talk." The connection opened doors Davy hadn't even dreamed of. With the foundation's backing, Roots to Rise secured funding for larger-scale projects, including building playgrounds, renovating community centers, and creating scholarship programs for underprivileged youth. Back home, the Parker family celebrated every milestone of Roots to Rise as if it were their own. And in many ways it was. The initiative had not only lifted their neighborhood, but had also given the family a sense of purpose and pride. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Maria turned to Davy with a mischievous grin. "So, Mr. Big Shot Leader, what's next? Taking over the world?" Davy laughed, leaning back against the bench. "Not quite. But I've been thinking, there's still so much we can do. Not just here, but in other cities, even other states. Roots to Rise, National Edition," Luke said, raising an imaginary banner. "Why stop there?" Maria added, "Go global." Davy smiled, their playful banter igniting a spark of ambition in his chest. He didn't know how far Roots to Rise would go, but he was ready to find out. Looking up at the stars that night, he thought of the journey that had brought him here. Every step, every choice, had built on the one before it, starting with a simple sandwich and a decision to care. The future stretched out before him, vast and full of possibility. And for the first time, Davy knew without a doubt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The vision expands. As Roots to Rise grew into a citywide success, Davy found himself swept into a world of opportunities he could never have imagined. Leaders from neighboring cities began reaching out, eager to replicate the program's success in their own communities. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements, partnerships, and collaboration on larger-scale initiatives. For Davy, it was both thrilling and overwhelming. At just 16, he had become the face of a movement far bigger than himself. One cold, crisp morning, Davy sat in his small, but now well-equipped home office, poring over expansion proposals. His mother appeared at the door with 2 mugs of tea, setting one beside him. "You've been working nonstop," she said gently, sitting across from him. "How are you holding up?" Davy leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm fine. There's so much to figure out. We've got 3 new chapters launching next month, a city council meeting about funding, and now people are asking if we can expand statewide. It's exciting, but it's a lot." She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Remember what I told you when you started all this? Don't be afraid to ask for help." "I have a team," Davy said, motioning to the pile of documents. "Marcus is running point on the new chapters, and Mr. Crawford's been amazing with the funding side. But it still feels like everything comes back to me." His mother reached out and placed her hand over his. "That's because you care. You've poured your heart into this, and it shows. But even the best leaders need to step back sometimes. Take a breath. Let others take the reins for a bit." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. She was right, of course. Davy had spent so much time building Roots to Rise that he hadn't stopped to think about how to sustain it for the long haul. If the program was going to grow, it needed a foundation stronger than any one person. That afternoon, Davy called a meeting with his core team. Marcus, Mr. Crawford, and a few of the program's regional leaders. They gathered in the community center's meeting room, a space that had become their unofficial headquarters. "We've got an incredible opportunity here," Davy began, gesturing to a map of the city pinned to the wall. Red dots marked all the current Roots to Rise projects, and blue circles represented the new chapters set to launch. But we need to make sure we're ready for the next step. This can't just be about what I can do. It has to be about what we can do. The room fell silent as Davy continued. I think it's time to set up a formal leadership structure, a board of directors, regional coordinators, and dedicated volunteers for each project. That way, we can share the workload and make sure every community gets the support it needs. Marcus leaned forward, his face lighting up. I love it. It's like taking what we've done here and giving it a solid backbone. Count me in. Mr. Crawford nodded in agreement. Smart move, Davy. The stronger the structure, the further this program can go. The others chimed in with enthusiasm, brainstorming roles, responsibilities, and ways to recruit more volunteers. By the end of the meeting, they had sketched out a plan to transform Roots to Rise from a grassroots initiative into a fully fledged organization. The changes rolled out over the next few months, and the impact was immediate. With regional coordinators in place, local chapters had more autonomy to address the specific needs of their communities. Davy focused on providing guidance and support, stepping back from the day-to-day operations to concentrate on the bigger picture. One of the first major projects under the new structure was a revitalization effort in a struggling industrial district on the outskirts of the city. The area had been hit hard by factory closures, leaving many families unemployed and the neighborhood in disrepair. The local Roots to Rise chapter, led by Amara, organized a series of initiatives to breathe new life into the community. Davy visited the district one afternoon, walking through streets that had once been barren and neglected. Now, murals adorned the walls of abandoned buildings, and new businesses were beginning to sprout up. He stopped by a small park that the chapter had restored, where children played on freshly painted swings and families gathered at picnic tables. Amara greeted him with a wide smile, her face glowing with pride. "Can you believe this?" she said, gesturing to the vibrant scene around them. "It's like a whole new neighborhood." "You've done an amazing job," Davy replied. "This is exactly what Roots to Rise is all about." Amara's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her hands. "I couldn't have done it without you, Davy. You believed in me when I wasn't sure I could handle this. That made all the difference." Davy placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't need me to believe in you. You already had it in you. I just helped you see it." As Roots to Rise gained momentum, word began to spread beyond the city. A regional nonprofit reached out, inviting Davy to speak at a conference for community leaders. Nervous but excited, he accepted the invitation and spent hours crafting his speech. On the day of the conference, he stood backstage, gripping his notes tightly. The audience included government officials, nonprofit directors, and seasoned activists, people with years of experience. What could a 16-year-old say to them that they hadn't already heard? But as he stepped onto the stage and looked out at the crowd, he reminded himself of why he was there. He wasn't an expert, but he had a story about how small acts of kindness could grow into something extraordinary. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "When I was 14, I gave my lunch to an elderly man in the park. It wasn't much, just a peanut butter sandwich. But that moment changed everything for me." He told them about his family's struggles, the birth of Roots to Rise, and the ripple effect of one simple act. By the time he finished, the room was silent, every face turned toward him with rapt attention. And then they rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the auditorium. The conference was a turning point. Organizations from across the region began reaching out to partner with Roots to Rise, offering funding, resources, and expertise. Davy's story inspired others to believe that real change was possible, no matter where you started. Back in his neighborhood, the success of Roots to Rise continued to flourish. The community garden expanded to include a greenhouse, allowing them to grow fresh produce year-round. A new youth center opened, offering after-school programs, mentorship, and career training. And for the first time in decades, the neighborhood was featured in the local news, not for its problems, but for its progress. One evening, as Davy sat on the porch with his mother, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to him with a smile. "You've built something incredible, Davy. But more than that, you've shown people what's possible when we care for each other." Davy looked out at the street, where kids rode bikes and neighbors chatted on their porches. The air buzzed with a sense of hope and possibility. "It's not just me, Ma," he said. "It's all of us. And this is just the beginning." The vision of roots to rise stretched far beyond the horizon, and Davy was ready to keep building. One act of kindness, one community, and one dream at a time.